let's take a few minutes to go over what a responsive grid is and how it works. A responsive grid for web design is generally made up of either 12 or 16 columns, which would be represented by the pink in this image here. And you can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 columns here. Now again, usually 12 or 16 is going to be the magic number for a responsive grid. In this case it has 12, and there are gutters in between, so the white space would represent gutters. Now when you're using a framework that's already created this grid for you, you also have div classes that allow you to span these columns to create different layouts. This is something I want to go over with you because it can be a little bit confusing to start with. In order to achieve a one-column layout, you have to span all the columns in the grid, in this case 12. And in order to achieve a two-column layout, you have to span with two containers half of the columns in the grid. So in this case, a two-column layout is going to be containers that each span 6 columns. Now again, for a 3-column layout, within a 12-column grid, you have to have containers, if you want them to be 3 equal columns, that span 4 columns each. And so you have to do a little bit of math when you're figuring out how to set up your layouts while using the grid. And the reason I think this is important to communicate to you is because most of them are set up, most frameworks are set up where they give you classes that you can use. So for example, we have Skeleton here as an example. And the way that you can write these is by using div classes of things like 2 columns, 10 columns. And I think that that can be a little bit confusing because you would think if you wanted a 1-column layout, that 1 column would be what you would need. But you need to understand that in a 12-column grid, 1 column is only 1/12 of the width of the entire container in the entire grid. So in order to achieve a single column layout, you actually need to span 12 columns, which is what you're seeing here. So that's how a responsive grid works. And the way that it degrades when it moves down to a responsive device width is also something that I want to go over with you. So what I've done is to use Skeleton. Yet again, this is just one CSS framework that provides a responsive grid. It provides all the CSS already written for us to have a grid, and this is what the grid looks like. And it's actually very similar to these pink columns, because Skeleton is a 12-column grid, so it has one of these. Their widths may vary, the gutter widths may vary, but in general this is what this would look like. And what we're going to try to do is use a demonstration to show how to span each one of these so that you can achieve a 1-column layout, a 2-column layout, or a 3-column layout. And then I want to show you how this changes as the device width narrows. So what I've done is just to set up a basic demo using Skeleton. And you can see here that we have column 1 in a 3-column layout, column 2 in a 3-column layout, and column 3. So this would be a 3-column layout. But you need to understand that in terms of writing the code, in order to get 3 columns, I have to span 4 columns in the grid. And that is because 12 divided by 3 equals 4. Likewise, to span all of the columns that I need to create a 2-column layout using a 12-column grid, I have to span 6 columns with 2 containers each, because 12 divided by 2 equals 6. And to achieve a single column layout, I have to use a container that's going to span all of the columns in the grid. So in this case, with a 12-column grid, in order to achieve a 1-column layout, I have to span 12 columns total. I'll show you my code for this really quickly to help make sense of it as well. So here's the HTML that I've written for this, and you can see this first row right here within this container. This first row is the one that has the 3-column layout. And so you can see here that in order for me to span the proper amount of columns to achieve a 3-column layout, I need 3 divs that span 4 columns each. And that's how I achieve that. Now for the second row here, where I'm trying to achieve a 2-column layout, I want you to note that I have a new row, and within that row I have 2 divs that span 6 columns each, because again 12 divided by 2 is 6. In my final row I have a single column layout, and that single column must span 12 columns to achieve a single column layout. So hopefully that's clear. Let's talk about now how they degrade when you're moving to a smaller device width. So in our example here, I want you to pay attention to what happens specifically with columns 1, 2, and 3 as I resize the browser window. So I'm going to resize the browser window, and you notice that for a while everything just shrinks, right? Everything just gets more and more narrow. But once we hit a certain point, in the case of skeleton, that point is 550 pixels. When we hit a certain point, all of the columns move from taking up whatever distance you told them to, be it 3 columns, 4 columns, 12, to taking up a single column. So at 550 pixels on skeleton, everything becomes a 1-column layout. But I want you to notice that column 1 is at the top, column 2 fell in line beneath that, and column 3 fell in line beneath that. So this is important to understand when you're trying to go from planning a desktop layout to a mobile layout, because you need to understand if you've already created a desktop version of your site and you use a responsive grid, that this is how it's going to degrade. So it's going to go from left to right, and they're going to fall in line underneath each other, top to bottom. So you can notice this with columns A and B as well. When I span down past that 550 pixel width, you'll notice that column B falls beneath column A. And because they're both contained in a row together, they're going to stay together. They're just going to stack vertically. The same here, because these are all in a single row. And what I mean by that is I've declared a row div that I've wrapped all of these columns in. And since they're all in the same row together, what that means is that they stay together, and they actually start to look a lot more like the HTML code here, where you can see column 1, column 2, column 3. And then because columns A and B are in a row together, they stay together. They just stack vertically, where you have A and B. And here you have A and B. And then the 12-column layout doesn't change that much, right? It's a single column, so it just gets more narrow, and it's going to get taller to accommodate the content that's inside. So hopefully this is clear. I want you to understand this, because as you're building a responsive layout, it's very important for you to understand how it's naturally going to degrade. Because if you don't, then you end up having to write a lot of CSS to override the grid that you're using. And what you really want to do is try to work with the grid rather than against it, and only override the grid settings when it's absolutely necessary. So this is just a quick introduction to how a responsive grid works, and again a little demo of skeleton, and an explanation of how to do the math to achieve the column layout that you want to create. So I do want you to understand that the CSS classes for skeleton, or for any other framework grid, are going to name one column as 1/12 or 1/16, depending on if it's a 12 or 16 column layout. And in order to be able to actually achieve a full 1-column layout or a single column layout visually, you have to use 12 columns instead of the 1-column selector. Again, a 1-column selector would be this big instead of the full width. So hopefully that makes sense, but spend a little bit of time trying to understand that. Take a look at some of your work, and if you haven't set it up to be responsive yet, then go ahead and do some diagramming so that you can try to understand how that's going to work in a website like this. So if this was your navigation bar across the top with 3 links, just make sure that you understand that once you enable that responsive functionality, that column 1 will stay at the top, column 2 will fall in line beneath it, column 3 will fall in line beneath it, at whatever point a responsive breakpoint is defined in your CSS. So in the case of using skeleton only, because it's already in the code, at 550 pixels, these columns all wrap into a single column layout, and they all fall in line beneath each other. That magic number will be different depending on what framework or what grid system you're using. And there are others where there may be more steps in between. But in this case, Skeleton is a very, very simple grid and a very, very simple framework, and all it does is move from a full width down to a responsive or a mobile width of a single column.